This week, we'll continue talking about the church's primary mission, making disciples, with Jarrod Spalding, co-founder of Vision Partners. I'm Charles Gallagher, president of Vision New England, and your host for the Church in Action. Jarrod, thanks so much for being with us. Really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. Totally my pleasure. I'm really glad that we got a chance to talk.
So do me a favor, for folks who maybe don't know you or Vision Partners, could you give a little bit of biography, background, how you came to be where you are?
Yeah, absolutely. So let's see. I have deep roots here in New England, but after college, ended up pastoring in Ohio for 15 years. So about 6 years ago, my family and I moved back to New England, sensing that maybe God was asking us to do something different here, and part of that we thought was church planting. I knew going into it that really it was something to sort of catalyze and influence movement forward, and so the more time we spent here in conversations with leaders, we realized that as important as church planting is, there's a lot of churches that don't have access to real help in terms of helping them figure out how to make disciples as a church, not just sort of implementing new programs, but actually making disciples over time and teaching people to do that kind of thing. So what it birthed was that we noticed there was a significant gap between what small churches could actually access and afford and what resources were out there. And so we began to dream and develop what it would look like to serve smaller churches. And so about 4 years ago, my partner, Kim Richardson, and I launched what we call Vision Partners, the idea being that we want to help churches go where God's leading them. We feel like God's already at work doing something unique in all these different contexts. And so the question is whether the churches are realizing what God's already been up to, what's God doing in their neighborhood, and how they can join in with that, as opposed to just trying to figure out something on their own. And so obviously disciple making is a massive part of that. So I think a lot of churches really struggle with that. But so far to date, we've worked with churches as small as 6 and as large as 2,000. So we've kind of been all over the map. Most of our churches are in that range of around 35 to 70 in all truth. And so that's really kind of where we put the bulk of our effort, is in those churches. So.
And we should be clear, full disclosure, Vision Partners and Vision New England are two separate and distinct ministries.
Yeah.
We love what Vision Partners is doing, so I'm not trying to get away from that. I just don't want to confuse folks.
Totally.
And so I got a thing from an optometrist firm a few weeks ago trying to sell us lenses for our customers.
That's right. Yeah.
Maybe the best answer. and so we've been talking about how disciple making is the primary mission of the church. That a disciple is someone who disadvantaged themselves to love and serve people the way Jesus did. The spiritual practices are what God typically uses to transform us to be like Jesus. Is that, in your work with churches, is that commonly understood, or is that something that I think a lot of us are learning?
So it's interesting. I think from sort of like an intellectual, like head knowledge kind of thing, it's understood. That definition is generally understood, but in practice, it rarely translates into practice. It rarely translates into how to do it. And so I think that there's sort of a number of barriers there that causes that. One is that when we think organizationally, like as a church is really designed to equip its people to make disciples. The church itself, and then maybe this is different than what a lot of people think, but the church itself isn't necessarily the disciple maker. The people in the church are. And I know there's been a trend to shift away from like the church is the people. Some of that thinking, I think, still hasn't reached a lot of congregations. And so they expect the church to deliver programs that are supposed to make disciples, when it's actually the church is supposed to equip and train the people to go make the disciples. And so in practice, we've kind of gotten some things backwards. Trying to pursue church growth, which is good, right? But that tends to mean that we're building bigger programs to kind of house more people at the expense of actually teaching people to make disciples themselves.
Yeah, it struck me, you mentioned programs. It struck me last week that we need to be sharing this with more churches, that if your growth strategy is programs, you're going to fail.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. That doesn't mean programs are useless and bad thing. It just means if that's your strategy to grow, that was a strategy that maybe worked 40 years ago. It is not a strategy for today. And making disciples, though, increasingly is being recognized as that is the strategy to grow.
Yeah. One of the things that we find is it's so, a lot of times churches think there's a new book, there's a new conference, there's a new thing that comes out. They think if we can just do that, we're going to grow. Can we launch, a new sports ministry in town because that's where all the families are. And those things aren't wrong. Like you said, they aren't wrong. But one of the things that we find is it's not so much the actual program as it is whether or not things are missionally aligned. Like if you are to make disciples, then you're going to necessarily say no to certain programs because they don't align with that work of making disciples. Yeah. And so there's that. This is sort of another barrier that a lot of churches struggle because they haven't decided that they're really going to make disciples. They haven't decided that that's actually their mission. And when you don't have a clear mission, when you don't have a mission to kind of catalyze and really set the direction of your church, you're bound to just say yes to kind of anything and everything because they sound good. It's sort of the tyranny of the urgent, right? Like,
and I don't know what else to do.
Yeah, and I don't know what else to do. So we're going to try this kind of stuff. Where like our position is more, let's figure out how do we actually equip people to make disciples, and then build programs that actually help accomplish that. Versus the other way around.
And so there's the threshold issue of, do we agree this is our job? And I think I don't think we all do think that, right?
No,
I shared at a thing recently that I looked at just the job postings on our website that churches send us when they're recruiting for a pastor, and half of them didn't mention the word disciple in them. Yeah. And so we may conceptually agree, but to your point, it doesn't get into practice. And so, but even if I conceptually agree, now we have the barrier of, I don't know how.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And one of the things, it's interesting you say that, because one of the things we're finding across the board in New England. So just for context, we do some work outside of New England, but we focus here.
We're going to pretend that's not true, but okay, go ahead.
So what we're finding is that a lot of pastors have sort of quietly admitted that no one discipled them. What they were taught is preaching and care and seminary level theology and things. Again, all good, except no one has personally discipled them. So the way that they know how to do it is programmatically through an organization, not individually. And so when we say that, there's the second piece that we keep running into is we find a lot of people don't know how to listen well. And I say that in terms of like a skill, right? It's actually a skill you can develop. But I say that because a lot of people who aren't Christians will tell you exactly where they are spiritually if you're willing to listen well to them. A lot of people have no problem. There's a lot of information and studies out there, but a lot of people have no problem talking about spiritual things, talking about Jesus. The problem is the church has just trained its people to invite people to church, not to listen to them, listen to where they are in life. I guess I could go on. My neighbor, one of my former neighbors, they moved just about a year ago. We spent a lot of time together in the pandemic because we lived across the street. We could play outside. Our kids could play together. And we talked. It took a few months, but over time, he more and more increasingly began to trust me to the place where we could talk about spiritual things. And he's the one that brought them up. Yeah. As I earned his trust. And so that's one thing we find in New England that's really, really helpful. When you say how to, like, part of the how is like you have to be willing to spend the time to earn the trust and listen to them before you begin to go, well, let me tell you about my church.
Yeah.
And it's not that they don't want to hear about your church or that your experience there. It's that their first inclination is not to say yes to an invitation. It's to actually figure out, are you trustworthy and will you actually hear me, instead of just trying to get me to go to your church.
And increasingly, they don't want to hear about our church.
Yeah, and that's true too.
There's nothing unique or different about you. Why would I find that an interesting conversation? Right. As a common theme we hear, I think, and you mentioned something that I think is an important point to draw out, is that Scripture is sharper than any two-edged sword, right? It's able to pierce apart, separate. So unless we read it superficially, So those programs, that Sunday school, right? I come from a cradle to grave Sunday school background, but if I'm just dealing with it superficially, it doesn't do what it's supposed to do.
Right. That's true.
Right. And so how do we find ourselves in this situation? Based on your work, do you have some theories?
Well, I think the church, just like the world, I mean, we go through eras of time, right? And we went through an era where church growth and having to expand and having to build bigger programs was a reality because churches were growing pretty rapidly, right? I mean, you think back to like the 90s, that's kind of the world I grew up in, is churches growing big and bigger churches and medium-sized churches and things like that. And so there was a time that I think it was effective in a moment. The problem is the church doesn't move quickly between contexts and between different, kind of societal changes. And so for me, I tend to look at things systematically, like kind of like an engineer putting puzzles together and building systems and things. So for me, when I look back, we haven't moved out of that growth area very, very quickly. And certainly not quick enough to respond to where we are today. And so churches still operate as if they are central to the community. They are a trusted entity in the community, and that they're sort of the central authority of morality and ethics and things like that. I'm not saying a church shouldn't be a sense of authority of morality and ethics. I think churches are very necessary, needed that way. But what's happened is the community at large has just moved on and forgotten that. Yeah. But churches still operate as if they are. And so we have these mismatching pieces, across the board. Our church people aren't learning how to make disciples themselves. We're continuing to try to gather when people, need to be deployed. We still think we're sort of this central authority when we're not. We're more irrelevant than we were before, especially in social issues and how to tackle those. And so there's just this number of factors that the reality is, I think we're perfectly designed to get exactly what we've got right now. And so, what we have at the moment are churches becoming more irrelevant and less effective and struggling financially and all those things. And spiritually, the vitality of the spiritual life of the church is dropping. And we have all of that because this is the system we've built.
Well, and part of the presumption that's said, I think about with programs more and more, is that programs were intended to give you something that you want to engage in.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And we kind of lost the piece of, you don't want this and you need to engage in it.
Mm.
Because I don't know I need to engage in it, so I don't want it. But also, I don't want to do, just like, I don't really want to work out every morning at 5:00 in the morning, right? Right. And so, but if I said I want to be a great ball player, but I really don't have time to work out, we'd say, okay, you're a dope, right?
Right. Like, good luck. Yeah.
But yet some of us are saying, I want to be like Jesus, but I'm not willing to do the practice, training, equipping that's actually necessary to do that. And in some ways we've said, that's okay. Whatever you want we'll take. Is that unfair?
Yeah. No, I don't think that's unfair. I think that there's there's certainly a pressure for pastors to continue to fill the seat, so to speak, because one, in some sense it validates their job and their role, right? Like that may not be entirely spiritual or healthy, but it's kind of real, if that makes sense. And so there's a validation that comes when you stand up at a pulpit or you stand up on stage or whatever you have, and you see a crowd of people. That's validating for our emotions and for our feelings and all those sorts of things. And
not to place it all on pastors. We lay people as elders.
Yeah, totally.
We tell them that's what we want too. That's your job.
Right. Yeah, that's your job. Gather people. Let's get a crowd together. And we think that's spiritually forming enough. But in reality, you're right. Like, just coming to a worship service, again, it's absolutely can be part of making disciples, right? But I've also seen churches in places where they don't gather for worship. because it might be illegal or they're persecuted, things like that. And yet they're still making disciples.
Yeah.
And so I look at it as like what we look at in the North American church is sort of a worship gathering. Again, it's not wrong, but it's also not the most important piece to the whole puzzle. Yeah. It's a piece of, not the whole thing.
It's a critical piece.
Yeah.
But,
totally.
But it was all that was necessary. Then Jesus could have saved himself a lot of trouble with these 12 other guys and just preached his sermons.
That's right. It would have been so much easier, wouldn't it?
So if we look at his model, it would say preaching is not sufficient. Something more is necessary. And that goes to this kind of doing life together and training and equipping and righteousness, which is spiritual practices and challenges and conviction and rebuke and all those things, which I don't think most of us experience in church life.
No way. I mean, well, who wants to be rebuked?
Well, I keep saying nobody in 30 years ever said, Charles, that did not reflect the love of God. And I can't believe it's because in 30 years, I've never done something that didn't reflect the love of God.
Yeah, exactly. I think we, again, it comes down to a how-to. If our pastors aren't being discipled, then they're not naturally going to disciple, naturally. And that's the trick, right? Is that a lot of pastors are just acting out what they've been taught, how they've been in culture to do this. So if they're not doing it, then it's pretty reasonable to assume the lay people are just going to follow the pastor, not rock the boat necessarily.
And in New England, we don't want them to change anything anyway.
Even if it
doesn't work, we don't want it changed.
Yeah. Well, we want a lot of churches want something that works right now. But like you're saying, like if we're going to follow Jesus, it takes time and work and like effort and the grace of God and leading of the Spirit and all those things. But churches aren't different. If you want to change the culture of your church, it takes time and effort and work and the guidance of the Spirit and prayer. It takes all of that because change it's not a light switch.
Yeah.
It's not an on-off switch that you just flip and then now we're all different. It doesn't work that way.
And so now tell us a little bit about Vision Partners and how you guys step into this and what that looks like.
So we noticed, speaking of New England, one of the things that we, being, roots in New England, both Kim and I, roots in New England, the thing that he and I noticed was that churches don't do well with experts coming in telling them what to do. And I will say this, there's other places in the country where that's still pretty acceptable, where an expert can come in and say, here's your 5 steps. I've done the research. I did the study. Here's the survey data. Do these 5 things and you'll grow. That is still accepted in some places, right? But in New England, it's not. The number of times,
which, by the way, just to draw it out, we're not commanded to grow.
Right.
Numerically.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
That's our goal, right?
Yeah. And so we knew early on that if we were going to really help churches, it would take a couple things. It would take a process, not a model. So like, for example, a model is something we can come and superimpose from somewhere else. If you just do these 5 things, everything's gonna be great. You'll grow big, with those sort of kind of mentalities. I know that's really simplistic. I don't mean to put it down.
Exactly what's been happening for decades, right?
Yeah. So we knew there needed to be a process because a process allows us the time and space to actually figure out the pieces that need adjusted, the dials that need turned, and maybe some things that need stopped, some things that need started, some things that just need adjusted, right? A process allows the time and space for that to happen. But it also does this one thing that we think is pretty critical. It moves the pastor out of the expert chair as like the end all be all, the person who says like who the congregation looks at and goes, well, tell us what to do. It moves them out and pairs them with the lay leaders in the church, and they work at it together. So what comes out of process is something that's collaborative. It's discovery-based. It allows them to figure things out. So we knew there had to be this kind of process because churches aren't going to hire experts to come tell them what to do. And the process means that we are more facilitators. We're not experts. So that perspective shifts. Yeah. We might have expertise, but we don't step in as like, let me tell you what to do. Yeah. The church, the laity and the pastor, the leadership, they figure that out together in that process as they work together. So that was one thing that we kind of knew coming in. So we've developed a process designed for small churches. Again, those smaller churches, because because we've seen the process and the tools for large churches, and they don't fit. I mean, for example, we used to have this one exercise, this one tool that we used that would help you kind of figure out your programming, what programming you do have. And when the first couple of times we used it, some of our churches literally had like Sunday mornings. And there was nothing else. So they didn't have anything to cut. Yeah. There was no stopping anything. They needed to start a bunch, kind of thing. So what we do is designed specifically for those smaller churches, the under the 150 and down, in all honesty. We have scaled up, to bigger churches, but that's kind of our target. The other piece to it is that the process then is backed by coaching. The big pitfall for small churches is not a lack of vision, like ideas and future thinking. There's a lot of pastors that are great at that in small churches. The problem is implementation. Again, most pastors, here's another spot that pastors aren't typically taught, is they aren't taught how to lead change well. And so they think it's a light switch. They get up on Sunday morning, they preach a message, they tell everybody we're going to do this differently. In their mind, they flip the light switch. In real life, the congregation is like, well, what do we do? Now we don't know what to do.
Yeah, change management, right?
And then it moves right back to, and they default to what they've always done then. So when we back it up with coaching, we'll spend up to 3 years with a church. And that design process piece takes roughly that first year. The next couple of years, we're just coaching through it, watching for the pitfalls, because there's some common ones, obviously. But really helping the church make adjustments as they go forward, making choices going forward. How do we choose what's the right opportunity? How do we say no to something? How do we say yes to others? And leading the change well. Because you still have Sunday mornings. I mean, we haven't had a church cancel their Sunday mornings yet. so that still is a thing. A lot of times you have prep for Easter, prep for Christmas, prep for Thanksgiving, back to school. All those things still exist. We're trying to help them missionally align all of those things so that it leads to disciple making. That's part of the process. But really the coaching is there because we know that inevitably the pastor is going to get sort of worn down and worn out and just go, I don't know what to do with this. And we stick by their side through it. And so ideally that improves the chances of them implementing well.
Yeah. And so there's a bit of change management I hear in that.
There is. Yeah.
Right. I've worked with churches where they say, hey, this is the thing we're going to do. And I remember talking to one pastor and saying, okay, if you're going to do that, you're going to have to change this, and you're going to, your Sunday morning will have to look like this. You'll need to start leveraging that. You'll have to,
that's right.
And he knew it was a big cultural change. And when I listed all those things, he said, we're not doing any of that. And I'm like, okay.
Well,
so how are you going to do this? And,
yeah.
Right. And then the whole thing went away. Right.
Yeah.
I never heard about it again. And so it's, I want the results of change, but I don't really want to change.
I don't want to have to change what I'm doing to get there. Yeah.
And I don't know how to do it, even if I want to, right? They don't teach change management in seminary. And so
no, they don't.
Unless you're kind of wired for it or had a good manager, right? You probably don't have much experience leading a big change initiative.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that because the couple pastors we've served that were actually businessmen or business people before pastoring, and pastoring is sort of their second career. They have absolutely zero issues implementing.
Yeah.
Right. Like it's interesting. Like they just go through and they're like, okay, we know how to do this. So I got to delegate here, and this person, we got to move the person over here for new responsibility. They seem to get it well. Pastors who have been career pastors, things like that, it's like they've never heard of such a thing.
Yeah.
So it's interesting.
Yeah. It's, there's so much that seminaries just can't equip or don't, or can't equip pastors to do that are so relevant in the roles they end up doing, right? There's so much other doing. And so that's where you guys are stepping in, is you're facilitating a process, but it sounds like you're also bringing some of those skills that may not exist in the congregation.
Yeah, ideally that's exactly it. It's that we can be sort of a strategic outsider for them, and we can help them from a bird's eye view, because we've been through this, we've done through this. I mean, both Kim and I have been pastors before, so me 15 years and Kim somewhere around 40 years of pastoring, and so we bring a wealth of experience to it. And so, yeah, so we really think that coaching piece on that back end is really, really important for churches to be able to keep their focus and stick to it.
And so it's very clearly coming through. There's a piece of the work you're going to do with me that really is about, let's say I'm a church bringing you in, that's going to be about vision and mission, and now figuring out ministries that align to that vision. How does making disciples play into those things?
Well, I think it's the engine that drives everything. And so what we like to say, or what we like to do is, like, when we think about mission, crafting a mission is about setting a direction for your church. It's a directional kind of statement, and it helps organize your people to move together. It's sort of a rallying cry. It brings them together. But then the real trick is, like, you can take that and you can have a vision state, a picture of the future. You can draw up, like, this is what we want the future to look like in 5 years, and work backwards and create a plan. But the problem is that it's the discipleship that always gets you from where you are to where God's calling you. It's always that. It's like, we liken it to sort of what happened with the Israelites leaving Egypt. There was a mission to get out of slavery. Moses, here's your mission: get them out of slavery, like, get them out of Egypt. It's mechanical almost, right? Like, it's pretty concrete. But the vision, right? The vision then was this, like, going to a land flowing with milk and honey, which is very almost flowery, right? Like, it's very artistic almost, in terms of its description. It's very descriptive even. It's not even prescriptive, it's descriptive of where they're going to end up. The problem is it took them wandering for 40 years to get from one place to the other. And as I like to say, like, if I was preaching this message, I'd say the problem is that they had to get all the Egypt out of them, not just get out of Egypt, they had to get the Egypt out. Yeah. And so when we're talking with churches, it's not just like you need a mission and you need a picture of a vision of the future. You have to do some things to get rid of certain stuff and add certain things into these people. That's discipleship, right? It's becoming more like the character and the competencies of Christ, in them, so that they can make disciples. And that's the engine that really drives it. And so we try to be careful, and sometimes I'm maybe not as clear as I should be, but we try to be careful to say that discipleship's the tipping point. If you're not discipling, the other two pieces really are irrelevant. Yeah. They're just statements on a page. Yeah. Those two statements help with direction and collaboration and keeping your church moving together. But discipleship is what makes it move. It's where the growth kind of happens. It's where the change happens, the transformation.
So are you going to, because most of our churches would say we don't, if they're honest, right? Mm-hmm. The collective feedback we've gotten is we're just not very good at this. Doesn't mean nobody is, but the typical church is struggling with this. Will you then be spending time with me as the pastor and leadership team, teaching us how to make disciples before we can start having a conversation about vision? Yeah.
So I would say it depends. It kind of depends on each church. So the process we use, we have a process, but we also contextualize it per church. And so if there's a church that specifically needs more of a focus on equipping, like, the skill sets and things like that, and helping people learn how, we certainly would do that and employ that with that church. Other churches don't necessarily need that as much, as they're just sort of effectively, like, throwing a whole lot of things out there and they're just disorganized. Yeah. So the answer, it's a yes and no. It kind of depends on the church, but yeah, absolutely. If a church needed some time just to figure out how do I tell Charles how to make a disciple, and how do I help him practice it? That's the key too, is, like, how do I help him practice it? Yeah. Because it's not just knowledge transfer, right? I could tell you, 5 steps, but whether the option is whether you do it. Yeah. My friend Joe Reed likes to say, I don't want my kid to put his finger in the outlet. I shouldn't have to explain why. I just want him to do it because it's good for him. And so some of that disciple making stuff is like, hey, we just need to do this. Like, you may not fully grasp it until you've actually done it. I can explain it to you, just like I can explain to my kid AC and DC current. It won't make a difference. He'll still want to put his finger in the outlet. I just need him not to do it.
Well, I always let my Irish Catholic guilt play into it, like, okay, how's just because Jesus said to? Will that work for you? Is that a good enough rationale?
It's a pretty good trump card. Yeah, it's a pretty good card to throw down. Yeah.
And so now I want to make sure we get this in, because we're running a little bit late, but I want to make sure we get this in. But so some people say, hey, I like what you're talking about. This sounds really interesting and good.
Yeah.
How do I find out? How do I find out more? And what if I can't afford it?
That's a great question. First, you find out more. We're pretty simple. We try to keep things very simple for churches. Pastors, in those smaller churches are pretty overwhelmed with multiple jobs and things typically. So visionpartners.church is a good starting place. That's our website. You'll get to go. You'll see some testimonies from other pastors and things like that, and some stories of the work we've been doing here in New England. So that's a good starting place, visionpartners.church. Just start there. There's ways to message us and connect with us and all that sort of stuff. The second question, what if you can't afford it? So this has been part of our heartbeat from the beginning. We know what we do most churches can't afford. So that's why we've purposely structured ourselves as a nonprofit, so that we could create, scholarships and donor base and multiple revenue streams to support the work that we do. So most churches we work with, we tell them the value of what we do the starting value is $12,000 over the 3 years. However, we have not had a church yet in New England pay even half of that, because we work pretty hard in the background to find the support and the scholarships for them. So no churches, and again, we're talking over 3 years, so no church has paid, anything more than probably $6,000 over 3 years.
Yeah. Because I love that model, that so many people are willing to step in and try and help churches with this. But the reality is, at the end of the day, you're starting at the wrong point if you're starting at this point of the conversation saying, I can't afford this. Right?
That's right.
If it's of God, I think he has ways to resource things.
Yeah, totally. And that's the thing, right? Is there's so much faith and walking. The Israelites wandered for 40 years, and it's going to feel like wandering for a little while, because you're building, you're growing new things, you're designing new things. So, yeah.
And we don't really want you to come in with all the answers and just tell us what to do, but in a way we kind of do.
Right.
We want it fixed, by June.
That's right. That's right.
And that's just not practical. And so I appreciate that you guys are doing so much to bring other resources into place, so this is affordable for smaller churches. But I just appreciate your ministry. Thanks so much, and thanks for making time for us today too. Oh man, Charles, it's been great. I'm such a huge fan of Vision New England and what you guys are doing, and I'm so grateful for the way you connect leaders across the region. It's been, that's such a helpful key thing that as we can start to partner together, because Vision Partners isn't the only people out there. So if we're not the right group, we'd love to point people into a different direction, to another ministry, another group that can help them. And so we've learned and met a lot of new friends through the work of Vision New England. So I'm really grateful for you guys. Thanks. I'm grateful for the partnership too. God bless you. I'd also like to thank Jess Mangano, our producer, and our listeners. This program is created by Vision New England, which accelerates evangelism by helping the church make disciples, do justice, and foster unity, so that we can share Jesus and lives can be transformed. You can find more resources at visionnewengland.org. This program is brought to you by our friends at the Luis Palau Association, who are dedicated to proclaiming the good news, uniting the church, and impacting cities worldwide.